In the Ethics of the Fathers, we are taught, Hafachba v'hafachba dekulaba. Take the Torah, turn it this way and that, and you will discover that we can derive from it guidance and inspiration for every single situation that we face in life. I would like to give you an example of this through a study of the subject of conflict resolution, taking our cue from biblical sources. We will derive 8 methods, strategies through which we can hopefully prevent conflict, and if tragically it exists, we can try to resolve it. In the first instance, we have to understand what's the root of the conflict. What has brought it about? So if I'm brought into a situation to be a negotiator or a mediator, I need to understand the real, deep, core reason behind this particular issue. And usually it's very helpful to go back to the first such instance of any phenomenon. So who can tell us, please, what's the very first conflict on record? Cain and Abel. Absolutely. You got the first family on earth. A mother and a father and 2 sons. And one son murders the other son. What's the reason? You can't blame it on peer pressure, television, the neighbors, the in-laws. There's something wrong within that family unit. What has brought it about? So interestingly, the Torah tells us, Vayomer Cain el hevel achiv, vayihi bayotam basadeh. And Cain said to Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in a field, and then they offered sacrifices. One appeared to be accepted by God, and the other appeared not to be accepted by God. But you know, we were told, Cain said to Abel his brother, but we're not told what he said to him. So obviously there was a dialogue. There was an argument. There was a fight. What were they arguing about? What ran to the core of that dispute? Yes, they noticed that one sacrifice appeared to have been accepted and the other not. But if you would drill deep down, what would you find right at the surface of this dispute, this conflict? And there is a midrash, and the midrash has 3 separate and very different views on the subject. According to the first view, Cain and Abel realized that they would be the heirs to their parents, the whole world would be theirs, and they needed to divide everything up. So they decided in the following way. One would receive all the karka, the other the metaltilin. That is to say, all land would go to one, and all possessions would go to the other. It seemed to be quite a reasonable allocation of everything in the world. One day they were out in the open field, and one said to the other, that land you're standing on, would you mind stepping off it? And he said, well, why? He said, well, it belongs to me. And he says, well, where am I supposed to go to? He says, that's your problem, not mine. All land belongs to me. And then the other fellow said to the first one, well, the clothes you're wearing, will you give them to me? He says, well, come on. He said, yeah, all property belongs to me. And it's in that vein that they started to argue with one another, and that brought about their ultimate dispute, prompting one to kill the other. Then there is a second view in the Midrash. According to this second view, it was an argument relating to women. Have you ever thought of where the women came from? Adam and Eve just had 2 sons. And then after Cain killed Abel, Eve gave birth to a 3rd son, Seth. So in the next generation, how did it all come about? So the Torah doesn't tell us everything, because the Torah is not a novel. It's not a storybook. It's a guide to life. So we're only given the facts on matters which provide lessons for our lives. So the Midrash comes to fill in the gap. And according to this second view in the Midrash, when Cain was born, he was one of twins. He had a twin sister. And when Abel was born, he was one of triplets. He had 2 twin sisters. Now, Cain and Abel agreed that Cain's twin sister would be his wife, and Abel's first twin sister would be his wife. But what about the second sister of Abel? Cain said, I'm the firstborn, she's mine. Abel said, she was born with me, she's mine. So they started to argue over that sister of theirs. And then there is a third view in the Midrash. The third view says that actually, like the first view, they saw that there was ground, territory, and possessions, and this is how they divided it up. They drew a solid line, dividing up the entire world into two parts. One would take the land and the possessions in one half, and the other would take the land and the possessions in the other half. And then one said, one day when the temple will be built, it will be built on my territory. And the other said, oh no, when the temple will be built, it will be built on my territory. Ladies and gentlemen, here you have the three prime causes of conflict in the world. The first relates to land and the economy. Have you ever thought of the origin of the terms in Hebrew for war and implements of war? Weapons, klei zayin, comes from the root mazon, which is food. Milchama, which means war, comes from what root? Lechem, which is bread. Ma'achelet, a battle axe, comes from the root ochel, which is food. Cherev, a sword, comes from pat chareva, a crust of bread. Everything to do with war and implements of war is rooted in food, because it's a truism of life. People who have full stomachs are far less likely to engage in a serious dispute, in a conflict, than those who have empty stomachs. No wonder, therefore, that the enormous trauma of the economic European crisis of the 1930s led to the Second World War and the Shoah of our people. And then there are those who believe in the concept of Lebensraum. This land is mine and it's not yours. All this is included in that first reason for conflict. And then there is the second reason, relationships. This person should be mine and not yours. Or somebody said something to me and I'll never forget it. I'll never forgive them. Sometimes you have family disputes. And 20, 30 years later, people actually don't remember what it was that caused the family dispute. But the main thing to know is that they're the side of the family that we don't speak to. And the same thing can happen in communities. And the same thing can happen at national and at international level. Relationships. And then there is a third reason. Religion. Religion should prompt people to love one another, respect one another, to live in harmony with one another. Tragically, religion has been the cause for a lot of bloodshed, especially when there are some peoples who maintain that theirs is the authentic faith, and there is no place in the world for anyone who asserts that anything other than that is the truth. Where the Beit Mikdash, the temple, will stand, that is the crux of the issue as far as they're concerned. And if, for example, one relates to the prospects for peace in the Middle East today, one will identify these three phenomena. First of all, a desire for land. And there are economic reasons for hardship and for bitterness. Secondly, there are relationship issues. What prospects can we have for peace if there are children who are being taught to hate and who are being taught to enshrine within their mindset how noble it might be to blow themselves up with as many innocent people as possible? So perhaps you might achieve a peace accord, but will there be genuine peace if we can't mend relationships? And then there is the issue of religion. And the reason why we have such an enormous challenge with regard to prospects for peace in the Middle East, Israel and the entire Middle East, is because the issues don't only relate to land and the economy and relationships, but there are issues relating to religion as well, which makes the challenge all the more difficult for us. So if you are a negotiator or a mediator, you need to know what the core issues are. But you also need to know something about the protagonists. What's their background? Why do they feel the way they feel? If I'm going to be dealing with these characters, well, what tactics do I need to employ based on the type of personalities that they have? And once again, if we look to that original family on earth and that original feud, we do find the answer. Yesterday, here at Limmud, in my shiur on the Parsha, I described the lives of Moses and his siblings, children of Amram and Yocheved. And I told you that really the only thing we know about Amram and Yocheved is their names. And the same thing really applies to Cain. All that we really know about him is his name, but actually his name, I believe, tells us all we need to know. Cain. What's the background to that name? You see, Adam and Eve were created miraculously by God. Cain was the first naturally born child to come about in this world. What did Eve, his mother, feel at the time of his birth? The sensation of producing a child, something never experienced before. She declared, Kaniti ish et Hashem. I have acquired a person, and now I'm just like God. God had produced Adam. God had produced Eve. Adam and Eve belonged to God, as indeed the Torah says. Avadaihem. We, the people of Israel, are the servants of God. We consider ourselves in a way to belong to Him. He created us. So Eve produced a child, and she said, I'm just like God. He produced Adam and me. Now I'm producing a child, Kaniti et Hashem. Therefore, he belongs to me. And so she called him Cain, which means an acquisition. And so Cain went through life bearing the name which constantly suggested to him that he belonged to his mother. He was hers. He wasn't to be an independent, mature, free-thinking person. Constantly, he had his mother hovering over him with her expectations for him. No wonder he couldn't grapple with difficulty and failure. No wonder he felt inadequate. And at a time, therefore, when his brother's sacrifice appeared to have been accepted and not his, he couldn't cope with that, and he took it out on his sibling. So as a result, if we understand the characters, we might have a chance to deal with the strife that exists in their lives. As we approach the situation relating to conflict and the prevention of conflict in the first instance, there is nothing that is more important than communication. I once heard a Dvar Torah given by Lord Jacobowitz Zatzal. It was in the Parliament building of Strasbourg. At the time I had come from Ireland to attend a meeting of chief rabbis of Europe. And he was addressing the commissioners. And it was a week which coincided with the portion of Noach. And this is what he said. The Hebrew term Yonah can be translated in two different ways. What is Yonah? Dove. What else is Yonah? Yes, because dove suggests peace, and in the Song of Songs, Yonati Avati, but there's another creature which is also called Yonah. You might not know it. Pigeon. So if you want to say a dove in Hebrew, it's Yonah. If you want to say a pigeon in Hebrew, it's Yonah. Quite fascinating. So Lord Jacobowitz brilliantly said, the dove is a symbol of peace. The pigeon is a symbol of communication, because the pigeon has been the carrier bird to take messages from one person to another, from one place to another, indicating that here within one creature you have a fusion of peace and communication, showing you can only achieve peace if there is communication, if there are two sides to an issue, to a conflict. Unless they ultimately speak to one another, you won't achieve peace. Yes, you can have negotiations and people representing them, but eventually they would have to speak to one another. And also the absence of communication can bring an enormous amount of harm. In the portion of Mitzorah, relating to a person who slanders another, and he's called Mitzorah because he is Motzi Shem Ra, he has brought about a bad name for the other person through his speech. The Torah says that in temple times that person would be expected to bring Shtei Tziporim Chayot Toharot, an offering, a sacrifice of 2 living birds. Why 2 birds? So the Zohar, that classical work of Kabbalah, tells us 1 bird he brings because of Lashon Hara, his bad speech, and 1 bird he brings because of Lashon Hara, Lashon Hatov, his good speech. Good speech? What's gone on here? So some commentaries in the Talmud tells us that there are occasions when you shouldn't compliment a person in the presence of that person's enemy. Because the natural retort will be, you don't know what you're talking about. No, you don't remember this and you don't know that. So effectively, by praising a person, you might be inspiring others to defame that person. But there is another way of explaining it. Sometimes there is an absence of Lashon HaTov, an absence of praise, an absence of gratitude. And that too can wreck relationships. When there is no expression of appreciation. And in that way, relationships can simply break down. So as a result, we realize how important it is to express one's gratitude. For this reason, I'm not sure if you're aware of the fact that the most important prayers we recite are prayers of thanksgiving. The main prayers for which we stand in shul are thanksgiving prayers. Mizmor LeTodah in the morning, Psalm 100, or Psalm of Thanksgiving. Vayvarech David, in which there are expressions of thanksgiving. Mizmor Shir Yom HaShabbat, the Psalm for the Sabbath day. Tov Lodot Lashem. It's good to give thanks to God. Modim Anachnu Lach. Even if you're sitting for the repetition of an Amidah, you stand for that. Hallel, you stand for that. Yes, there are some prayers for which we stand because they're important. The vast majority of those for which we stand are thanksgiving prayers. And also, when you give thanks, you shouldn't do it through a shaliach, through an agent. You should pick up the phone yourself to express that gratitude. And that is why in our prayers, the Chazan can represent us for all prayers except for thanks. So when it comes to Modim, our prayer for thanks in the repetition of the Amidah, that's something that I, within the congregation, must recite by myself to express that gratitude. And that also comes to the heart of the essence of prayer itself. You know, our prayer book is called a Siddur. Siddur comes from the root Seder, which means an order. Every prayer book in the world is ordered in the same way. So we can find our way around it. Whether Sephardi, Ashkenazi, Hasidish or Mitnagdish, it's all the same order. But have you ever thought of the order it's in? The first prayer in every prayer book is Shachrit for the morning. The second is Mincha for the afternoon, and the third is Ma'ariv for the evening. But we know that in Jewish tradition, our days go from sunset to sunset, as is the case on Shabbat and Yom Tov. So surely the first prayer in the Siddur should be Ma'ariv, the evening service, then the morning service, and then the afternoon service. So the answer is as follows. There is a verse, L'hagid baboker chasdecha ve'emunatecha baleilot. To relate the chesed, the loving kindness of God, to give thanks to God in the morning, and to express our faith in God at night time. One might presume that when we are vulnerable, when we want to express our faith in God, that's the prime purpose to come to shul, to engage in prayer. That's not the prime purpose. The prime purpose is Lagid Baboker Chasdecha, to express our gratitude to God. So if the nighttime prayer would come first, it would seem to suggest that we are there because we're in trouble, because we feel vulnerable, darkness is setting in over us. Yes, when those phenomena occur, we should come to God in prayer, but the prime purpose of prayer is to engage in God, to celebrate life. At the beginning of the daytime, to stand up and say, Modeh ani lefanecha, thank you God for giving me these opportunities, and to have a glorious, positive experience of a day ahead of one. And so too, when it comes to our relationships. Whatever the situation might be, one should count one's blessings and make one's blessings count through highlighting all the positive features in life and never missing an opportunity to express to others our appreciation, our gratitude for that which they do. And the absence of such praise could indeed harm relationships. The next point I would indicate is that sometimes there are people who fail consistently to have good relationships with others because they don't have a good relationship with themselves. They're not comfortable in their own skin. They feel inadequate within themselves, and as a result they've got a problem creating and maintaining relationships with others. So in the ethics of the fathers, we are taught, Hillel Omer, Hevemi Tamidav Shel Aaron, we should be like the disciples of Aaron, Ohev Shalom v'Rodef Shalom, Ohevet Habriot, loving peace, pursuing peace, and loving others. First of all, one needs to love peace, that is to say, to have peace of mind within oneself, to be at peace with oneself, and only afterwards can one achieve, or hevet habriot, to establish and maintain a loving relationship with others. And sometimes when one is confronted with a relationship crisis, one needs to understand that perhaps one of the people, if not more, have a problem within themselves. And it's not a straightforward issue. And speaking about Aaron the high priest, there is, of course, that well-known methodology of Aaron. The Midrash tells us that if there were two people in a dispute, he would come to one and say, you know something? The other person, the other protagonist, he really wants to have peace with you. You might think that's not the case, but he really does want it. And then he'd go to the other fellow and say the same thing. So they would both believe that the other one was interested in peace, and they would come together the next time they'd see each other, and they would have a positive attitude, and then they would be able to forge a new, lasting, good, and healthy relationship. Now, what Aaron was saying, was he lying? Not really. Because deep down, as bitter as the crisis might be, all of us actually do crave for peace. And my final point, before I come on to my 8 strategies, always remember that maybe I'm the problem. It's a standard phenomenon. You're faced with a crisis between various parties, they're always blaming the other side. But if I'm involved in a dispute, I must think to myself, maybe I'm the problem. What have I perhaps done wrong? What perhaps could I be doing without waiting for the other side to move first? There's the old story of the elderly man who goes to the doctor and he says, "Doctor, I think that my wife is going deaf. So often I'm speaking to her and she's not hearing me." So the doctor says, "Well, how serious is it? How deaf is she?" He said, "I don't know." So the doctor says, "I'll tell you. You go home, stand some way behind your wife when her back is to you and say something. And then come closer and closer and come back and tell me how close you have to be for her to hear you." So she was doing the ironing with her back to him. He came into the room and he said, "Dear, what's for supper tonight?" No answer. One step forward. "Dear, what's for supper tonight?" Stumm. One step forward. "Dear, what's for supper tonight?" Eventually, he's standing right behind her and he says, "Dear, what's for supper tonight?" She turns around and she says, "Fish and chips, like I've already told you 5 times. So you see, he thought that she was the problem, but actually he was the problem. And so too, it's not just with hearing in life. First step is, maybe I am the problem. So now, let us go on to my 8 methods of conflict resolution. The first we will call avoidance. And by the way, 5 of these I've taken from writings within sociology. The other 3 I've added from our own sources. And the first is called avoidance. Avoidance is when you bite your lip. Another word for it could be tact. You're experiencing in an ongoing which you really dislike. However, you decide to keep stum. I'm not going to say anything about it. And your rationale might be as follows. In this relationship, well, we're doing quite well. I suppose I'm scoring 7 or 8 out of 10. Okay, thank God. In most of the ways, things are going very well. So 2 or 3 out of the 10 issues, I can live with them. Unless, of course, you're scoring 9 out of 10, and then the one missing ingredient happens to be a vetoing factor, running right to the core of the essence of what the relationship should be about, and that would spell disaster. So usually, when you engage in avoidance, you just keep stum, you bottle it up. Some might say you're turning the other cheek, but it could be a positive reaction because we actually all use avoidance all the time. If every one of us would say to everybody else, every single thing that we dislike about their mannerisms and what they do and what they don't do, I don't think there'd be a single healthy relationship on earth. So, therefore, it's important sometimes to engage in avoidance. Now, who can mention for us, please, a mitzvah in the Torah for avoidance? Where in the Torah are we told that sometimes it's a mitzvah to be stum, to be quiet? Yeah?
When a bride asks you if she looks pretty.
Okay. So it's interesting. So What you've mentioned is the Gemara in Masechet Ketubot. Ketzam Noraktin Lifnei Kala, how do we dance before the bride? And Beit Hillel Omrim, Kala Na'ava Chasuda. Beit Hillel say, you should say you are a pretty and pious bride. Beit Shammai Omrim, Kala Kemot Shehi. Beit Shammai say the bride according to the way she is, which most explain, if she's pretty and pious, say it, and if not, be quiet. So you are right. According to the view of Beit Shammai, there is an occasion when you are quiet. But I must say, if the bride asks, right, you should say something nice. Okay? And then Tosfot there asks about the view of Beit Hillel. How can you say to every bride, you're pretty, you're beautiful, you're such a lovely person? Mitvar sheket tirchak, shouldn't we distance ourselves from falsehood? And Tosfot answers by saying, in the eyes of her groom, she's beautiful and she's good. So therefore, you cannot absolutely determine this bride hasn't got good looks or whatever the case might be. So yes, through tact, we need to respond to the situation. So well done for this. I would actually like a mitzvah in the Torah.
Hashem told Sarah that she was going to have the baby.
Yes.
She laughed. But when it was reported to Abraham, or Avram, it was admitted that Sarah was too old.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That's an occasion in which tactfully a detail was omitted. Really good. But it's still not a mitzvah. You must or you mustn't. I'm talking about a mitzvah which says you must keep quiet. Sorry?
Do not take revenge, do not bear a grudge.
Ooh, close. It's in the same chapter, Leviticus chapter 19. So we're getting really close. Right? Okay. He said, do not bear a grudge, and so do not take vengeance on another. So, because that relates to your attitude, which will then fashion what your actions might be. But there in chapter 19 of Leviticus it says, Lo tisnai et achicha bilvavecha, you must not hate your brother in your heart. Hocheach tochiach et amitecha velo tisa alav chet. You shall surely reprove your fellow and not sin on account of him or her. Hocheach tochiach. There's a dual imperative from which the Talmud tells us there's an imperative, hocheach, you must reprove, and there's also an imperative, tochiach, say nothing. Sometimes you might witness something that is really wrong, and you will choose to keep quiet. Why? Because by saying something, maybe the person won't listen to you. And now it'll be even worse. They know that it's bad and wrong, and nonetheless, they carry on doing what they're doing. It all depends on the circumstances, on the situation. So from here, indeed, we learn how important it is, sometimes even when confronted by something which is totally wrong, the time might come for you to be quiet. And therefore, in the ethics of the fathers, we are taught, Eizehu Gibor, who is a truly mighty person? Hakovesh et Yitzro, somebody who has the capacity to overcome his or her urge. When you take a deep breath, and you keep quiet, and you don't utter anything, that is the mightiest person on earth. Under such pressure, when you're not prompted to do anything which you might regret. Number 2, we call accommodation. You see, there's a difficulty with regard to avoidance, because you're bottling up all that emotion, all that feeling, right? You're constantly witnessing something, and again and again and again, and you're not saying anything about it. One day, something will happen, a small innocuous event, and suddenly it will just burst out open, and people wonder, how did that happen? Where did it come from? But it's all that pent-up energy and tension that will produce such a violent result. With accommodation, we're saying that you should express your dissatisfaction, however, not force the other person to do what you want them to do. So here you're saying, I disapprove of what you're doing, but it is your choice. So with regard to avoidance, let's say you have a 16-year-old child who's going out clubbing at night. And you're worried about it, is it the right thing or not? And you decide, I'm not going to say anything. With accommodation, I do say something. I say, I wish you wouldn't do it. Please stop doing it. However, I leave it up to you to decide what to do. Who can give me an example, please, from the Torah of accommodation? Where somebody is told, I wouldn't like you to do this, but it is your choice. Yeah? Sodom, that was Abraham saying it to God, praying, and then God then turned down what Abraham was saying, right? You know, this morning we had a beautiful tefillah here, and at the end I was asked to say a few words, so you've just reminded me to share these words with everybody. You know, that was the earliest prayer on record, and we remember it by davening Shachrit every day because Abraham prayed in the morning. Isn't it amazing that our morning Shachrit prayer is rooted in a prayer that failed? When Abraham prayed to God on behalf of the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah, and God didn't listen to him. So why is our prayer rooted in a prayer that failed? And the answer is there isn't such a thing as a prayer that fails. You know, there's the Chassid who said to his Rebbe, every day I pray for this particular thing and God never answers my prayers. And the Rebbe said, God does answer your prayers. He says no. And that's what happened with Abraham. He prayed to God and God said no. God takes our prayers and he channels them in an appropriate direction in our interest and in the interest of the whole world. And prayer provides us with an opportunity to engage with God, to spiritually uplift us. So thanks for giving me the opening to just share that nice little thought. But I'm looking for a different passage in the Torah. Somebody at the back there? Sorry? Oh, yes. Excellent. Excellent. 100%. Bilam senses that he shouldn't be going to curse the Jewish people. And God at first says no, then Bilam protests, and then God says, okay, but you should only go if you listen to what I'm saying. And implied in what God is saying is, Bilam, you really shouldn't be doing this, but I'm leaving it up to you. Well done, and there's an even better example of that. Yes? Spies, congratulations. Well done. Okay. So the Sedra of Shlach Lecha opens. God says to Moses, Shlach Lecha Anashim. Send men lecha on your own head. I really don't want you to be doing this, Moses. He was just about to test God. God had said, this is the promised land. This is why I brought you out of Egypt. It's the most incredible place for everybody to have the privilege, anybody to have the privilege to live in. The Jewish people were questioning the wisdom of God's move. So Moses wanted to send the 12 spies. God didn't stop him from doing it, but he said, Shlach lecha. You should be warned. It's not a wise move. However, it's your decision. Shlach lecha. Congratulations. So that is accommodation. And in accommodation, there is the major plus. You're saying it. God warned Moses. God warned the Jewish people. It's as a result of that sin that they had to stay in the wilderness for 40 years. They knew it had been their choice, but at least they were given the freedom to decide for themselves. Method number 3, arbitration, or we could call it third-party involvement. So who can give me a biblical example of this? There are two people who are locked in an issue, quite a bitter issue. Along comes a third party and dictates to them what it should be, and they accept it. Not really. So the answer there was King Solomon, because that is a context of judgment. Solomon is the judge. So the two women bring the baby to him, and it's for him to decide who's right or who's wrong. I'm here speaking about a relationship issue. There's a certain domestic difficulty. Yitro. Well, they were fighting against each other, right? He came along and he said, Lama taked re'echa, why are you smiting your brother? He tried, but he didn't succeed. In fact, they turned on him. And therefore, there's still a situation that I'm looking for. Benot Tzlofchad. So that was a question in halacha, in procedure, and Moses took it to God, and God told Moses what the law should be, which, by the way, is very significant. There are only 2 commandments in the Torah for which that happened, which were not given directly from God. But first, there was a protest, indicating that sometimes protests, demonstrations are legitimate. In fact, God encouraged the demonstrations to take place, further to which these 2 laws were given. One was Benot Tzlofchad, the 5 daughters of Tzlofchad who were demanding their rights. And the second, would anybody know? Pesach Sheni, phenomenal! Right, the second Pesach, there was the first Pesach on the first anniversary of the Exodus from Egypt, and there were some individuals within the Jewish camp who were Tmeim leNefesh Adam, they were impure, they couldn't celebrate Pesach, so they protested. They said, give us our Pesach. Can you imagine that? The original protest was for Jewish people who wanted Pesach. And they said, we can't do without it. And it just shows, with all the effort and everything that we put into Pesach, this is of course if you're celebrating it at home, there's still nothing quite like it. Sitting at that Seder table with your family, enjoying that festival of freedom, it is incredible. And God responded and he said, okay, I'll create for you a second Pesach, 1 month later for all those who missed out on the first. But we still haven't come to the answer I've been looking for. Moshe and Korach is not right here because there was Korach against Moshe. I'm talking about A versus B, and C comes along and says A is right, or B is right, and they're both accepted. Sorry, Sarah?
Sarah and Hagar.
Congratulations. Well done. Sarah and Hagar. So, you've got within the household of Abraham and Sarah their son Isaac, who's going to be the heir to their spiritual heritage. And in the same home, you've got Hagar and Ishmael. And Ishmael is taunting Isaac, and he's making life a misery for him, and he's a very bad influence upon him. Sarah says to Avram, cast them out. Abraham says, what are you talking about? They're our mishpacha. And she says, but look what's happening to Isaac. It will have implications for all future generations. And Abraham says, come on. The hallmark of my existence is chesed, is loving kindness, and you're asking me to send my own son out of my house to an uncertain future? What were they going to do? They took the issue to a third party, God himself. And what did God answer? Kol asher tomar elecha Sarah, shma b'kola. He said to Abraham, whatever Sarah says to you, listen to her. The first message given by God to a husband was, listen to your wife. Okay. And then Abraham sent his son Ishmael out, but God did say, don't worry, I will protect him. And he will have 12 sons, and he will have many generations, and they're with us to this day. And Abraham then had the comfort of knowing, thanks to that third party, God himself, that what he was doing was right, even though he had thought otherwise. And that's the beauty of third party involvement. The downside of it is that when you're taking your dispute to a third party, you are formalizing the dispute. Once it's just between me and you, we can feel comfortable about it because nobody else knows. If, however, you're taking it to the arbitrator, to the third party, then it becomes formal. And I have learned that as a community rabbi, sometimes I've been well positioned to help members of my community through family disputes, and sometimes I've immediately recognized that it was a mistake for somebody to tell me about it. When was that a mistake? When they would then mention to the other party, I've been to see the rabbi, and they'd say, you went to see the rabbi? To tell the rabbi about our difficulty? The embarrassment is enormous, a sense of shame, even though the first party was trying to help. So therefore one should approach the third party when both individuals want it. That's the only way in which it will actually produce a good result. Of course, sometimes if there is a great need, you should go and discuss issues with another person to gain some professional help. That's something one should be doing. But in respect of involving that person as an arbitrator, as a mediator, that should come through the desire of both people who are concerned. And so we find that in the verse we are told, Titein emet leYaakov, chesed la'Avraham. Give truth to Jacob, loving kindness to Abraham. The hallmark of Jacob's life was truth. The hallmark of Abraham's life was chesed, was loving kindness. And isn't that quite remarkable? Because Jacob is known for the most infamous lie. And yet, Titein emet leYaakov, he is the archetypal biblical character of truth. Abraham is known for loving kindness. Yet look what he did. He sent his own son out of his home. And from here we learn that when it comes to principles, we shouldn't stick by our principles to the nth degree without considering common sense. Because sometimes there can be a rare exception through which we might even need to overturn an important principle for the sake of a higher goal. And that is why we determine in our tradition that there are three things which are yareg v'al yavor, three cardinal sins for which we may never make any exceptions. Apart from that, there can be a situation in which, for the sake of the rule, I must make an exception to the rule. So that is third-party involvement. Once it is used and the assistance is given, it can be a very powerful force for good. The fourth method I would call force. So force is where? So for example, you've got that situation of the kid who is clubbing. And this time there's no avoidance and there's no accommodation. The parent says to the child, I forbid you from doing it. You're gated. Right? After this time in the night, you're at home and that is it. That is force. You basically lay down the gauntlet, you set the tone, and you're emphatic. So who can give me an example, please, in the Torah of force? Somebody's challenging somebody else, yeah?
When God doesn't let Moshe go into Israel.
God doesn't let Moses go into Israel. You mean it's force from God?
Right.
Okay, yes, and Moses pleaded, Vayitchanan, please allow me to go. And God said no. But I would say that's more a decision of God with regard to the future of us, as is the case in every situation in life. God ultimately determines what will happen to ourselves personally and as a nation. But I'm talking about somebody who challenged another person, and instead of that person kind of engaging in the challenge, well, I'll avoid it, or maybe I'll accommodate it, the person says, no way, under no circumstances. He laid down the law. What was that? Pharaoh with Moses and the Israelites. To some degree, yes, but Pharaoh there wasn't there. Yeah, to some degree. Yes? Okay, so there have been a few suggestions. Lot's wife. You mean God and Lot's wife? Yeah, okay, but that's a general situation of people are commanded not to do something, etc. But somebody did shout the answer Korach, and that was the one I was looking for. Not to the exception of every other suggestion. So Korach challenged Moses and Aaron. And Korach said, I'm your first cousin. You think that your blood is more blue than mine is? Not at all. And he claimed the right to be the leader of the people. He was challenging not only Moses' authority, but God's authority. Now, under such circumstances, Moses couldn't engage in avoidance. He couldn't turn the other cheek. Nor could he accommodate this to say, Korach, you must know, I really don't like what you're doing, but it's your choice. Not at all. Moses couldn't bring in the Security Council of the United Nations to determine the issue. This was a call for strong and effective leadership. And therefore Moses said, Korach, I want you to know, if you carry on with this dispute, the earth will open and it will swallow you and your followers up. It was Moses' idea that that should happen. Now that's leadership. Because you're putting not only your leadership on the line, but your spirituality on the line. Your link with God, who will be a partner of yours in the leadership of the people. That was force. And what was the result of force? You see, force has a major plus. People know where they stand. It kind of resolves the issue. You know that you're not allowed to do it. However, in the wake of force, there are always pieces to pick up. What happened the day after Korach and his 250 followers were swallowed up out of the ground? The people didn't turn to Moses and Aaron and say, wow, you're incredible, you're wonderful. They said, Atem hamitem et am Hashem. You have killed the people of the Lord. Moses and Aaron, you're to blame through being so forceful that precious lives have been lost. That's how people sometimes think. They don't think logically. They don't appreciate what transpires when it comes to true, strong leadership, and they blame those leaders for anything that might happen. And that's what happened in the aftermath of that force. So force is something to be used very sparingly because it will have negative consequences. And then we come to method number 5, which is separation. Who can give me an example from the Torah? Yeah, way at the back, separation. Fantastic! Lot and Avram. Great. So, we're told that Hanefesh Asher Asu B'Charan, all the souls that Abraham and Sarah had produced, their followers in their thousands came with them when they made Aliyah to the Holy Land. And once Avram had arrived, he couldn't get on well with his nephew Lot and his shepherds with Lot's shepherds. And Avram realized that no mediator in the world was going to resolve this one. The only thing that would help would be separation. And so he took Lot to a certain space. And he said to him, look this way and right. And if you go to the left, I'll go to the right. And if you go to the right, I'll go to the left. Lot chose the fertile plain, which was alongside the river Jordan, where the Dead Sea is today. Abraham moved away from him. They separated. And it was Abraham who realized that sometimes close members of family don't have to live in the same house. They don't have to live on the same street. They don't have to live in the same suburb. Sometimes, to keep a healthy family unit, it's actually a good idea to live in different countries. But please don't misquote me to say he advises families should be separated, different countries. That's not. This is the exception to the rule. But sometimes we need to realize if you really love somebody, because of all kinds of quirks in relationship issues, it's better to give a bit of distance, a bit of space. And that's what Abraham realized. The fact that he separated from Lot didn't mean that he didn't care about Lot. Later on we read that in the war between the 4 kings and the 5 kings, Lot was kidnapped, he was taken to Damascus. Abraham galvanizes the forces of 318 men from within his household. He forms an army and he fights. He is willing to lay down his own life for the sake of his nephew, the one that he separated from, and he succeeds in saving Lot's life. So that is separation. And indeed, therefore, sometimes when it comes to family issues, it can be tragic, it can be very sad. But thank God our Torah provides for opportunities to separate in order that people can have, hopefully, a happy, independent life ahead of them. And then we come to number 6, compromise. Compromise is win-win. In compromise, everybody can claim victory. What's the Hebrew word for compromise? Pshara. What's the root of the word pshara? Pesha, but it comes from warm water. Mayim poshrim. You see, when you have warm water, the hot water can say, this warm water is hot water, it just became warm. And the cold water can say, this water is cold water, it was just warmed up a little bit. So both sides can claim that the outcome is actually a victory for them. That's the beauty of compromise. I know of just one compromise in the whole of the Bible. Gosh, and if somebody knows it here, you'll be pronounced Biblical Scholar of the Year. Okay. Nobody want to try? Not so much of a compromise. That's the 2.5 tribes. Reuven, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh. They wanted to settle in what is today the country called Jordan, on the east side of the river Jordan, and they were allowed to. It wasn't a compromise. Yes, they were asked to go and fight to show their allegiance to the rest of the people. It was more an arrangement. They didn't have to give up anything. At the back. Was there a suggestion there? Do you mean Yaakov and Lot? Yaakov and Lavan? Yes, that was payment. It wasn't a compromise. He got what was due to him. He didn't get a discount. Okay.
Joseph and the pit, some of the brothers wanted to kill Joseph, and others wanted him to survive, and they put him in the pit instead of...
Yeah, that's not bad at all, but it was... So there, one of the brothers, unknown to the others, wasn't that he struck up a compromise. You know, he took Joseph out while he was able to. Yeah? Not so much of compromise. That was an entire disgrace, that situation. Is there a hand up at the back? Was that a compromise? I think that was more an arrangement to maintain property within certain tribes. Yeah, I'm looking for a standoff situation, right? You've got people, their views are totally polarized, and somebody has to come up with a method through which somehow we can bring them together despite their significant differences between each other. So I'll tell you the example I found. It's in the second book of Kings, chapter 20. So, what happens there? With the aid of the Talmud in Masechet Brachot, page 10a. So, God wanted the prophet Isaiah to give a message to King Hezekiah. Isaiah said to God, okay, good. Tell Hezekiah to come and see me. Hezekiah said, tell Isaiah to come and see me. Isaiah said, I am the prophet, the man of God. Let the king who is the political head of the nation come to me. King Hezekiah said, my Davidic line was instituted by God himself. This is a spiritual line. As king of the people, I also have a holy task. God wanted Isaiah to meet up with Hezekiah, to give him a message, and there was a standoff. Both were insisting that the other should come to him. So whose problem was it? It was God's problem. So what did God do? We read in chapter 20 of the second book of Kings that God brought sickness upon Hezekiah the king. And he said to Isaiah, go and practice the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim. Pay a visit to the sick king, and while you are with him, give him this message. So Isaiah went to visit the king. The king said, that's so good of you to come and visit me while I'm ill. And Isaiah said, I've come here to perform the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim. And while I'm here, God wants you to know whatever it is. So God, therefore, utilized this form of pishara, of compromise, to bring the two together. And both could claim victory. And as far as both of them were concerned, no precedent had been created. Number 7, apology. An apology and forgiveness. Biblical example, please. Fantastic. Joseph and his brothers, having been read by us so recently. Jacob had died. Now the brothers felt they were in real trouble. Joseph's going to turn upon us. Father Jacob is not with us anymore. And they dreaded what might become of them. And Joseph turns to them and he says, Achtem chashavtem alai l'ra'ah, v'Hashem chashava l'tovah. You know, you sought harm to me, but actually it was all part of God's plan. You don't have to worry. I am forgiving you. And how wonderful it was that Chief Rabbi Warren Goldstein at the memorial event at the stadium in Johannesburg likened Nelson Mandela to Joseph. A pity, however, about the fellow standing to his left who was doing the signing at the same time. But indeed, Nelson Mandela showed that same element of forgiveness. That's the power of forgiveness. And so often you have disputes, and each side is waiting for the other to give the apology. I won't do whatever it is unless there will be that apology. Sometimes it goes beyond all limits of reason. So if you can be somewhat forgiving, it can facilitate a rapprochement which can provide an end to that conflict. And the same principle, thankfully, is used by the Holy One, blessed be He, as far as we are concerned. Because sometimes we choose to be in conflict with God. We stand up to Him. We reject His commandments. We turn our backs on Him. And God has come up with the most marvelous concept called tshuva, which is repentance, an opportunity for us to put our past behind us. And the finest way that I can present you the concept of tshuva is through the following very simple story. There were parents who had a really difficult kid. He was getting up to all kinds of trouble. And so the father one day thought, okay, this is what I'm going to do. He called his son and he said to him, I'm putting up a long plank of wood up here on the wall in our home. Every time you are naughty, I'm going to knock a nail into the piece of wood. And let's hope there won't be many nails. The kid was naughty, one nail went in. Another time, another. Nail. Eventually the kid came into the room and he saw all these nails Gosh, he thought, I'd better improve. This is terrible. So he started to be a well-behaved child. And then one day he said to his dad, Father, please take the plank down. And the father said, yes, you are a reformed individual. You deserve for it to be taken down. But he said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the nails from out of the plank. And when that happened, the boy started to cry. And the father said, why are you crying? He said, I can still see the holes where the nails used to be. And the father says, well, I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do about that. Now, the greatness of tshuva is that when God forgives us, not only does he remove the nails, he also removes the holes where they were. And we're given a fresh opportunity to start off on a clean slate, so that for the rest of our lives, we can do what is appropriate. So this method of apology and of forgiveness is not only one which relates to our relationship with others, but it's also one which underpins God's relationship with us. And now I come to example number 8, which is the finest method of them all. It is called cooperation. So with cooperation, A is saying this must be the case, B is saying that must be the case. Along comes C, and C says, actually, I'm going to create a situation in which A and B will be forged together to create a scenario which is far better than what A and B were actually wanting. And they will both celebrate this outcome. It's an amazing result. So we have, in the writings of the Talmud, the 13 principles of Rabbi Ishmael. And one of them is, where you have two verses which contradict each other, and the third verse comes along, and it describes for us what really took place, and it's better than both previously suggested scenarios. A prime example. We're told that when God gave the Torah to us at Mount Sinai, Min Hashamayim, God spoke to us from the heavens. And the second verse says, Vayered Hashem al Har Sinai, God came down on Mount Sinai. So the question is, well, where was he? Was he in the heavens or was he down here on earth? And the third verse comes along and tells us, Min Hashamayim al Haaretz. He spoke to us from heaven and he was on the earth. And what does this suggest? That at the time when the Torah was given at Mount Sinai, God folded the heavens and the earth together for that most incredible moment in the history of the world, through which they became one single entity. And therefore God spoke from one place. It was both heaven and earth. So this third scenario is actually better than both 1 and 2. I'll give you an example of cooperation, where I know there was a synagogue where there was tension between a main synagogue service and an alternative minyan service. And what was the result at the end of the day? They knocked down the shul. And they built another shul, which was more inclusive, which served the needs of those going to the alternative minyan to make it more inclusive, more women-friendly, etc. And the main shul people had their way because they were in the main synagogue, etc. It's a creative idea. It's thinking out of the box, through which you can actually come up with something which is better than what both the protagonists are actually suggesting. That usually is the finest way forward. So these strategies can be employed to any situation in a domestic context, in a communal context. You can apply 1 or 2 or 3, sometimes a few of them at the same time. Let's look, for example, at the crisis that Israel has within the Middle East, and you will see that every single one, except for the last of these strategies, has been continually used. Avoidance. Time and time again, we dislike what our enemies are doing. The finest example of this happened when Scud missiles were flying through the air, having been sent by Saddam Hussein in Iraq, potentially attacking our cities and our inhabitants. Israel wanted to do something in those early 1990s. Israel showed huge koach. Ezehu Gibor, outstanding strength through restraint. Avoidance, through doing nothing. And that's how we were able to prevail at that time. And then you have accommodation. Sometimes Israel does protest and does say, what you are doing, what you are trying to do is wrong. We won't stand for it, but does not insist in any way. Then sometimes you have force, where Israel has no alternative but to go in and to make certain that certain situations will be ended, because what threatens us could spell the end of our country. Sometimes you have arbitration, the involvement of a third party, the quartet, and primarily the United States of America, sometimes the United Nations, where others are welcomed, because perhaps they can assist in enabling us to move forward for the sake of peace. And then separation, the fence, the wall. It's not a wonderful situation to have a separation between some citizens and others, but thanks to that separation, numerous lives have been saved. Just like Abraham and Lot. Sometimes it can provide, where there are no other alternatives, for a way forward. And then sometimes compromise, land for peace. And then sometimes you can have apologies. As recently as was the crisis between Turkey and Israel, where part of the arrangement through which the two countries could move diplomatically forward was Turkey's insistence on an apology from Bibi Netanyahu and the Israeli government. There is only one method which hasn't been properly used. It is the last one, which is cooperation. And I believe that it will be through cooperation that, please God, one day we can achieve peace. It's when we move away from our entrenched positions and with maturity and a sense of vision and creativity, we think of an out-of-the-box way forward. The type of cooperation which only last week encouraged Israel and Jordan to join in an arrangement relating to allocation of water in the area, similar cooperation should surely be used so that together we will find, hopefully, a way forward to provide peace for everyone in the Middle East. Hafachba v'hafachba dekulaba. Take the Torah, turn it this way and that, and you will find inspiration and guidance for every situation in your life. I hope that you've seen here today how the whole question of relationships in our private lives and at community, national, international level can gain inspiration from our biblical sources. And now for the last minute of my presentation, I want to end with an idea which is attributed to Chief Rabbi Cook, the first Chief Rabbi of the Holy Land. It's an idea that I mentioned in my installation address at St. John's Wood Synagogue on the 1st of September, one which means a lot to me, and I hope it will mean a lot to you. You know, in a symphony orchestra, you have different instruments. Each instrument, while being played by itself, is uniquely different from the others. Under the baton of the conductor, together all those instruments produce beautiful harmony. And so too it is within society. Some people mistakenly believe that actually when they talk about unity, what they're really talking about, some people believe that when speaking about unity, really it's unity they're talking about, but it's actually uniformity they're talking about. Uniformity is when everybody needs to do the identical thing. Unity is when each person is different, where each instrument plays its own music. And together, under the baton of a desire for human coexistence, we together are able to produce beautiful harmony within society. That is what we should strive to achieve through avoiding conflict. And when there is tragic conflict, that's what we should strive to achieve through resolving it. And may the Almighty bless us all to achieve that level of harmony, that beautiful unity, that through true peace, through acting together in our own individual and unique ways, all under the baton of a desire to get on well together and to take us as a nation forward through to a glorious future. Thank you.